Jerry Quarry gave everything to boxing, and it gave him nothing in return. Instead, it took everything: his health, his legacy, and ultimately, his life. He fought the best heavyweights in history, went toe-to-toe with legends, and for a moment, he seemed destined for greatness. But instead of becoming a champion, he became a tragedy. What really happened to the Bellflower Bomber? And how did his life take such a heartbreaking turn? He was given a label he never wanted, suffered a career-defining loss, and in the end, boxing destroyed him. A man who could have held the heavyweight crown but was doomed by the very sport that made him famous. And the way he lived was tragic. But the way he died? Even worse. Because Jerry Quarry's story isn't about what he won. It's about what he lost. He had the power. He had the skill. He had the heart. But his life wasn't a tale of triumph. It was a disaster waiting to happen. He was supposed to be boxing's next big superstar. A powerhouse with dynamite in his fists, a chin made of steel, and the kind of toughness that made crowds roar. But instead of holding up championship belts, he ended up holding the short end of the stick. Because Quarry didn't just fight in any era, he fought in a nightmare. Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ken Norton, all-time greats, all at their peak. And Quarry? He was stuck in the middle of that murderer's row, fighting his heart out just to stay afloat. And when boxing fans look back, his name isn't remembered with the champions. It's remembered with the casualties. But who was he before the fame? Before the brutal wars that left him broken? Before boxing robbed him of everything? His career? His body? His mind? To understand his tragic end, we first have to go back to the beginning. Jerry Quarry wasn't just born into boxing. He was bred for it. Born on May 15, 1945 in Bakersfield, California, he came from a family that lived and breathed boxing. His father and brothers were all fighters, and in the Quarry household, boxing gloves might as well have been part of the school uniform. It wasn't just a sport for them. It was a way of life. For little Jerry, there was no plan B. It was either make it in the ring or get swallowed up by the same working-class struggles that shaped his childhood. Grit and toughness weren't traits. They were requirements. And from the moment he laced up his gloves, it was clear he had something special. Quarry seemed destined for the ring. As an amateur, he tore through the competition. By the time he was 19, he won the 1965 National Golden Gloves Heavyweight Championship, a title that had launched the careers of legends. With speed, power, and a chin that could take bombs, he wasn't just a prospect, he was a problem. People saw him as a future world champion, a fighter built for greatness. But here's the thing, boxing doesn't care about potential, and Quarry had the worst timing imaginable. Because just as he was climbing the ranks, he walked straight into the most dangerous heavyweight era in history. Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Ken Norton. All killers, all in their prime. This wasn't just a tough time to be a contender. It was a horror movie. Could Jerry break through? Or was he just another name on their hit list, destined to be remembered not as a champion, but as a stepping stone for legends? In the late 1960s and early 1970s, an era where boxing was still racially divided, boxing was dominated by black heavyweights with Ali, Frazier, and Foreman at the top of the division. And in the midst of it all, the media slapped a label on Jerry Quarry that he never asked for and never wanted: the Great White Hope. This wasn't just a nickname or marketing term. It carried weight, ugly racial undertones that turned Quarry into something he had no desire to be, a symbol in a fight he never signed up for. He wasn't trying to restore anything. He didn't care about being the face of white America's boxing dreams. He just wanted to fight, to win, to make a name for himself. But the media and promoters used it to push a narrative that a white boxer could take back the heavyweight crown. And once that label was on him, there was no shaking it. Wherever he went, it followed him into the ring. It didn't matter who he fought, The storyline was always the same. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was carrying the expectations of an entire race. For Quarry, this was a nightmare. But despite the unwanted attention, he never let the pressure break him. He was tough as nails. He had speed, skill, and knockout power. His record spoke for itself. Wins over top contenders, highlight reel knockouts, and an iron will that made him a fan favorite. He earned respect the hard way and wasn't afraid of anyone. He stepped into the ring with legends. He fought Muhammad Ali twice, Joe Frazier twice, and battled dangerous opponents like Ron Lyle, Ernie Shavers, and Ken Norton. But no matter how good Quarry was, he had one fatal flaw. He took too much punishment. He could dish it out, but he could take it too. And that was the problem. Because in boxing, toughness is a gift until it becomes a curse. Some fights leave a mark on a career, others leave a scar that never fades. For Jerry Quarry, his 1970 bout against George Chuvalo was one of those nights. This is the fight that still sparks debate to this day. He was in control, winning on the scorecards, outboxing Chuvalo, doing everything right. And then came the 7th round. Chuvalo landed a brutal left hook. Quarry went down, but he wasn't out. He got back to his feet, took a knee to gather himself, and then stood up just before the count of 10. But before he could even steady himself, the fight was over. Referee Zach Clayton had already made his decision. He waved it off. A knockout victory for Chuvalo. Quarry was stunned. The crowd erupted in outrage. His corner was furious. To many it looked like a robbery. Quarry had beaten the count. He followed the rules. But the referee called it a stoppage anyway. He felt cheated, robbed of a win that should have been his. And in a career filled with brutal fights, this one hurt the most, not just physically, but mentally. But if Quarry thought this was the worst heartbreak of his career, he had no idea what was coming next. Jerry Quarry's career wasn't just tough. It was a war zone. He fought in an era where sparring wasn't safe. Fighters didn't use headgear, and training wasn't about sharpening skills. It was about proving how much punishment you could take. Fighters prided themselves on toughness. He sparred with legends, took unnecessary damage before the fights even started. And when he stepped into the ring, he didn't just try to win. He tried to out-tough everyone and absorb punishment instead of avoiding it. Against some fighters, that worked. But in his wars with Ali, Frazier, and Foreman, it was a death sentence. Ali cut him to shreds in both fights. Frazier's relentless pressure wore him down. Foreman's devastating power left permanent damage. Quarry's biggest problem wasn't just the competition. It was himself. His fearless style made him exciting, but against elite heavyweights, it was suicide. Each time, he walked away bloodied but unbroken, until eventually the damage caught up with him. Each loss took a piece of him. Each war in the ring took a little more out of his body and mind. And in the end, there was nothing left. Like so many fighters before him, he didn't know when to walk away. By the mid-70s, he was a shell of himself. The years of punishment took their toll, but Quarry, ever the warrior, kept stepping back into the ring. Not because he should, but because he didn't know how to stop, and the world didn't do him any favors. With no financial safety net and no real long-term support, Quarry's post-fight career was a downward spiral. The money ran out. The opportunities dried up. And when boxing is all you've ever known, what else do? You keep fighting, even when your body is screaming at you to stop. And that's exactly what he did. Then, in 1992, at 47 years old, Quarry did the unthinkable. He stepped into the ring one last time. There was nothing left for him to prove, nothing left for him to gain. But he climbed in, chasing a version of himself that no longer existed. And what happened next was brutal. The damage was clear. He was slow. His reflexes were gone. His body couldn't take it anymore. And worst of all, his mind was already slipping. He lost that comeback fight in devastating fashion. It should have never been sanctioned, but it was, and it only pushed Quarry further down the road to tragedy. The real tragedy of Jerry Quarry's life wasn't just in his losses, it was in what boxing did to him outside the ring. All those fights, all those punches, the wars, the countless rounds of training with no headgear, they left him broken. By his late 40s, the damage was undeniable. Dementia pugilistica, a condition we now know as CTE, had already set in. His speech was slurred, his memory was fading. He struggled with basic tasks. By his 50s, he could barely take care of himself. His family did what they could, but there was only so much anyone could do. This once great fighter who had stood toe-to-toe with legends couldn't even remember the battles he fought. The same chin that had made him famous, the same toughness that made fans love him, had betrayed him in the end. On December 28, 1998, Jerry Quarry was hospitalized with pneumonia. Years of fighting had worn him down. His body was weak, his mind was gone, his strength had faded, and his once indestructible chin couldn't fight off time. 6 days later, on January 3, 1999, Jerry Quarry was gone. He died of cardiac arrest at just 53 years old. A man who was once the toughest of the tough, the fighter who had once been the hope of boxing, had been reduced to nothing by the very sport he loved. Jerry Quarry was never a world champion, but he was more than just another contender. He was one of the toughest men to ever step into a ring. He fought everyone. He never backed down. He gave boxing everything he had, but his career wasn't a success story. It was a cautionary tale, one that shows the dark side of boxing. The price of taking too much damage, the dangers of refusing to walk away. It was a warning, and in the end, it cost him everything. Because boxing wasn't just Jerry Quarry's profession. It was his executioner. It built him up, broke him down, and left him with nothing. No championship, not a legacy, just pain. And then it took his life too. Jerry Quarry's story is one of talent, tragedy, and wasted potential. He fought in the wrong era against the wrong opponents, but he never backed down from a challenge. If he had fought in a different era with better medical care and an emphasis on defense, things might have been different. But boxing wasn't built for safety back then. It was built for warriors, and Quarry was one of them. His death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a reminder of what happens when the sport gives too much and takes even more. So, what do you think? Should Jerry Quarry be remembered as one of the greatest never to win a title? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the tragic lives of boxing legends, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Thanks for watching.